Dear learners, I am Christina Georgy, your academic counselor, and I welcome you to my session. Today, we'll deal with the course code BEGC-112, which is titled British Literature, Early 20th Century. As per the request of some of our learners, we'll be recording this session. Today, we'll look at D.H.Lawrence and his widely acclaimed novel titled Sons and Lovers. So first and foremost, let's have a quick introduction regarding the life and works of D.H. Lawrence. Remember, D.H. Lawrence was a British novelist, and obviously he belonged to the early 20th century. If you look at his life in close details, he was born in the year 1885 in Eastwood, which is a mining village near Northanger. And his full name was David Herbert Lawrence, that is abbreviated as D.H. Lawrence, David Herbert Lawrence. And his father's name was Arthur Lawrence and his mother's name was Lydia Lawrence. You must be wondering why I am mentioning father's name, mother's name and the like. This is because in this particular novel, all these names are quite relevant. You can guess why. It's because it has got some autobiographical traces. Remember how we studied The Awakening by Kate Chopin as part of our BEGE-112? Likewise, this particular novel also displays some aspects of autobiography in it. So remember all these names. Okay. So we'll deal with a detailed life and works of D.H. Lawrence in another session. Today I'll just sum up the important points for you. So he attended a board school as a child, and there he won a prestigious award, which is more like a scholarship to Northanger High School. And his religious and moral education was received from the large Congregationalist community of Eastwood, which by all means reproduced and reinforced his mother's values of education, self-improvement and self-discipline. Remember, even in his life, his mother played a very pivotal role in his overall development. We look into that. Before that, I would like to mention a name, Jessie Chambers. This is also very significant. It's because she was his childhood friend, and it is on whom the character of Miriam in this particular novel is based upon. So this Jessie Chambers shared his passion for books and imaginative literature. They together read novels by many famous writers of those era, say Walter Scott, Stevenson, George Eliot, Dickens. And they also discussed the poetry of Blake, Longfellow, Tennyson, Swinburne and others. Historical romance and adventure featured strongly in Lawrence reading at this time. For those who are looking into your textbook, let me remind you, I am discussing Unit 6 from Block 2 of your IGNOU official study material. Then, later in the year 1906, he joined University College at Northanger. He studied teacher certificate, and in the year 1908, he took up a job as a teacher somewhere near London, I believe. But however, the strain of full-time teaching job along with the stress of his literary pursuits had serious effects on his health. He had some health problems, and as a consequence, what happened? He was forced to give up teaching. He stopped teaching, and it is during this time, or it is after this incident, that he started writing. Alright, now let's have a look at some of his early works. D.H. Lawrence's earliest writings were poems. Keep that in mind. His friend Jessie Chambers greatly admired his works, and she was the one who sent some of his poems to Ford Madox, who's also an influential editor, and these were published in the English Review. And this is how D.H.Lawrence became famous during those times. Speaking about his novels, two of the most notable novels include The Rainbow and Women in Love. Okay, you should study these two names at least. About his later novels, The Lost Girl in the year 1920 is important. Apart from that, he has written Kangaroo in the year 1923, The Plumed Serpent in the year 1926, and many more. It would be great if you could study the years in which The Rainbow and Women in Love are also written. The Rainbow is written in the year 1915, whereas Women in Love is written in the year 1920. Your study material gives you a brief overview, a 2 to 3 line explanation of the summary of the novel. That's optional. You can read that if it's interested. Anyway, I don't think they'll ask you a separate question regarding the life and works of D.H.Lawrence. So now comes the question, where do you make use of this? Yes, when you write your essay question, you can make use of all these details as part of your introduction to the essay question. I've already discussed this in many of my sessions. Other writings, which include poetry, stories, plays, travel books and essays, are also mentioned. He has also written a few novellas. What do you mean by the term novella? Novella. It actually comes between a novel and a short story. A short story is simply a work written in prose which is of shorter length. Yes. So, yes, Rinsa is correct. So is Rahul also. So, novella is more or like a short novel. Okay. It's not as lengthy as a novel, but it is much more lengthier when compared to a short story. So, how I used to teach my BA students is to remember like short story hyphen novella hyphen novel. Novel is the lengthiest. Next comes novella, then short story. So some examples of novellas include The Captain's Doll, written in 1923, The Fox, written in 1923, The Ladybird, written in 1923, The Princess, written in 1925, etc. About his short stories, a few examples include The Prussian Officer and Other Stories in the year 1914, England, My England, written in 1922, The Woman Who Rode Away, written in the year 1925. So I understand that it will be totally difficult for you to remember all these works. It's not just for you, it's for everybody else also. So how do you study? You can at least remember 2 of these. See, I would suggest you to study 3 so that you remember at least 2. Okay? Yes. About his essays, examples include Study of Thomas Hardy. Remember, Thomas Hardy was also another writer. So it's a study on another writer. Then Psychoanalysis and the Unconscious. Remember psychoanalysis? We discussed psychoanalysis when we were studying Kate Chopin's Awakening as part of this BEGC-112 paper. Yes, it's the same psychoanalysis. Fantasy of the Unconscious, written in the year 1922. See, this person, D.H.Lawrence, is also highly influenced by Freud and his concepts, his theories on sexuality and others. So, we look at that in course of time. Alright? Yes. So, try to remember a few examples. Another important point is that he has strong sense of environmentalism reflected in his writings. What do you mean by that? That is, he has a deep sense of place, which is evident in most of his writings. So, according to eco-critics, what do you mean by eco-critics? You know who a critic is, right? So, what do you mean by an eco-critic? A person who writes or criticizes on the aspects of environment. It is basically a eco-critic. He is basically an eco-critic. So, Lawrence's sense of place and of natural environment reveal is awareness of the ecological interconnectedness of human beings with non-human life. How human beings and the flora, fauna and all other non-human life are interconnected. Such a sense of understanding is always reflected in the works of D.H.Lawrence. Remember that aspect. Okay, you can make use of that also in your writing. So that sums up a brief overview regarding D.H.Lawrence. I hope I made it clear. Any questions? എല്ലാവർക്കും ക്ലിയർ ആയോ? ഇത് ഞാൻ മലയാളത്തിൽ പറയണോ? ആ കഥയൊക്കെ വരുമ്പോൾ ഞാൻ മലയാളത്തിൽ പറയാം, അത് പോരെ? So what I'll do is, before we move on to Sons and Lovers, the text as such, I find it very mandatory to have an introduction or an overview regarding this particular novel. You know, I'm very much aware that most of you, or rather none of you, have read the novel. It's fine, I'm here to help you out. Now let's move on to a quick summary of Sons and Lovers. So the protagonist, we already know who a protagonist is, the central character of a work of art. So the protagonist of this particular novel is Paul Morrell. Before we move on to Paul Morrell as such, let's have a look at Gertrude Morrell. See, it is with her that the novel progresses. Even though it starts off with Paul Morrell, we see a very unhappy Gertrude Morrell. It's basically because of her unhappy marriage to coal miner Walter Morrell, and they are settled in the English town of Bestwood. So this Gertrude Morrell, she is very much devoted to her eldest son. Remember, she has 4 children. The eldest son is William, the second son is Paul. There is also another younger son. We'll have a look at his name in course of time. Remember, she also had a elder daughter. So William was more or less her favorite child, but unfortunately William dies of a skin disease, and as a consequence Mrs. Morrell, you know, goes into a stage of grief and depression. Later she reoriented her desires and life and everything towards the second son, Paul Morrell. Now Paul has grown into being a young man, and he spends a great deal of time with a girl named Miriam Lever. She's a religious girl and she lives on a nearby farm. More or less, she's a neighbor. Okay, they share a very platonic relationship. It means that they didn't have any sexual kind of approach yet. But one interesting thing to note is that Mrs. Morrell was more of great dislike towards Miriam. She feels like Miriam is trying to take her son away from her. See, it's an act of possessiveness actually. She is actually becoming very much possessive of her son, and it is for that matter that she is more or less feeling some sort of bitter feelings towards Miriam. Later we also see that Paul grows attracted towards Clara Dawes. So she is much more older and she is a very sensual woman. She is separated from her husband. Finally, Paul and Miriam, they sleep together, but Paul soon loses interest in her and she is left alone and he is not willing to marry her. Later we also come to know that Paul and Clara also have this kind of a relationship. Romance blossoms, and as a consequence her husband, his name is Baxter Daves, he beats Paul one night, and there is some subplots related to that. When we come towards the main plot, we come to know that Mrs. Morrell develops a tumor, and after a long struggle she dies. Paul is very much concerned and he used to take care of his mother even till her last breath. We later see that Paul arranges the reunion of Clara. Who's Clara? The elder woman towards whom he had some sort of a love interest. Yes. So he tries to unite Clara and her husband. Yes, the interesting thing is somehow they befriended each other. Who? Clara's husband and Paul himself. Then we see that Paul and Morel move out of the house to separate locations. Paul feels lost and he is unable to paint anymore. He used to paint before also. That's one thing that I lost out. Then Miriam makes a last appeal to him for romance, but he rejects her. He didn't invite her to his life. He feels suicidal one night but changes his mind and resolves not to give into the darkness. So this is how the novel ends. Remember, this is a modernist novel. So you need to have a greater understanding regarding block 1 where they speak about an introduction to modernism. So if you are much aware of that background, you can read this text in a much better way. Now I'll provide you with a brief character sketch of at least the main characters. See, this is not directly mentioned in your study material, but this would help you in multifaceted ways. Firstly, you will have an idea regarding, a better idea regarding what is explained in the textbook. Secondly, they have given you analysis, right? So unless you know what's happening and which are the major characters, you won't be able to understand. So we'll start off with the protagonist himself, Paul Morel. Paul is the protagonist of the novel, yes we know, and we follow his life from infancy to his early 20s. Remember, from infancy to early 20s. You can also see this is a Bildungsroman. So what about the characteristic features of the protagonist of this novel? Paul. He is sensitive, he is temperamental, he is an artist, a painter, and the most important aspect is overtly devoted to his mother. They are more or less inseparable. He confides everything in her, works and paints to please her, and nurses her as she dies. We can say that to some extent, the mother is the reason for Paul's unsuccessful romances. His relationship falls more or less into a failure because of this aspect also. Okay. Now comes the mother character, Gertrude Morel. Mrs. Morel is unhappily married. We already discussed that. As a consequence, she redirects her attention towards her sons. Okay, they became her only passion in life. She is first obsessed with whom? The first child. The first son. Yes, William. And after his death, she becomes attached towards Paul. She bitterly disapproves of all the women these two sons encounter, and in a way we can say that she is hiding her jealousy with some other excuses. Now another important character, the lady love, Miriam. So she is a very religious girl, and we already saw that she lives somewhere near the Morel. She is more or less a neighbor. Remember, she is Paul's first love. She is the first love. Nevertheless, their relationship takes ages to move beyond the platonic and into the romantic. At some point it changes into the romantic mood, but he never accepted her and he was never willing to marry her. Now we have Clara Daves. Remember, she is the elder woman who is separated from her husband, Baxter Daves. She is more or less very sensual in nature, and it is her sensuality that attracts Paul. Okay, there is Walter Morel. Who's that? the coal mining head. And how is he related to the morals? Yes, he is the father. Yes. So he has become a cruel, selfish alcoholic, it is mentioned in the textbook. His family, especially Mrs. Morrill, hates him, and Paul also is not of great opinion. Okay. Then there is William Morrill. Who's William Morrill? Gertrude Morrill's favorite son, but he dies due to a skin disease. Then there is Baxter Davis. Who's that? You all know, Clara's husband. Later, towards the end of the novel, Paul tries to reunite these two. Okay. There is Annie Morrill. Yes, she is the daughter that I mentioned. She is a school teacher who leaves home fairly early. Yes. There is Arthur Morrill. That is the youngest son's name. Okay, he is exceptionally handsome, it is mentioned, but also he is immature. So he rashly enters the military, and it takes a while until he gets out. He marries Beatrice. That is also another character, a minor character in the novel. Okay, so these are the major, or rather the characters that you should be aware of. There are also some other minor characters, Mrs. Radford, Thomas Jordan, Agatha Levers, Edgar Levers, etc. Fanny, Polly, Connie, all these people are there. They are the minor characters. It's okay even if you are not much aware, but it would be great if you could have a deeper understanding on all the characters in the particular novel. We are going to discuss something very important from the examination perspective. So this is explained in detail in your study material, but I'll give you an overview prior to discussing the study material. Firstly, the concept of Oedipus complex. As I mentioned, we already discussed this as part of our study regarding BEGE-144. We discussed the Oedipus complex. I hope you remember. Yes, anyway, I'll give you an overview regarding Oedipus complex. This is one of the most celebrated theories on sexuality, which is put forth by Sigmund Freud. We already discussed Freud and his psychoanalysis while we were studying the awakening. So the name, the Oedipus complex, comes from the title character of the Greek play titled Oedipus Rex. So in this particular play, as part of the story, Oedipus is prophesied to murder his father and have sex with his mother. That is, it was said that he would kill his own father and marry his own mother. And Freud argued that these repressed desires are present in most young boys. That is the theory that was put forth by Sigmund Freud. The female version is also called Electra complex. So in short, if a boy, a young boy, develops feelings towards his mother, that is kind of a sexual feeling. If he develops that, if he becomes possessive of her, Freud said that it could be because of Oedipus complex. And the same if it happens with the girl child, the feelings towards the father, then he coined this as if Electra complex. So how is this concept relevant with respect to this particular work? Let's check that out. So D.H.Lawrence was very much aware of Freud's theory. He was aware of Freud's theory, and Sons and Lovers famously uses the Oedipus complex as its base for exploring the relationship between the mother and the son. Who's the mother? Gertrude Morrill. And who's the son? Paul Morrill. We all know that Paul is hopelessly devoted to his mother, and that love often borders on romantic desire. So Lawrence writes many scenes between the two that go beyond the bounds of conventional mother-son relationship and love. Another thing to note is that Paul also hates his father, and he often fantasizes about his death. That is also an aspect related to Oedipus equation. That is, he hates his father and loves his mother. That is one thing that you need to notice. But we can say that Lawrence has added a twist to the Oedipus complex. That is, here in this particular story, Mrs. Morrill is also saddled with it as well. That is, she desires both William and Paul in near romantic ways, and she despises all their girlfriends. That is, she is too possessive and too fond of these two people. Firstly William, and later after his death she used to be in such a relationship with the son Paul, younger son Paul. And because of this overtly expressed love, concern and aspects such that she more or less hates anybody who comes near Paul. In a sense, if there is anybody who's about to have kind of a relationship, a romantic relationship with the son, she would despise them. In the sense, she would hate them. So she too engages in transference, projecting her dissatisfaction with her own marriage onto a smothering love for her son. That is, at the end of the novel, Paul takes a major step in releasing himself from his Oedipus complex. Okay, that is also mentioned. Now, another theme is bondage. So this bondage is discussed in two major ways in this particular novel. Firstly, in a very social way, and secondly, in a romantic way. Socially, Mrs. Morel feels bound by her status as a woman and by industrialism. A romantic bondage is given far more emphasis in the novel. Paul feels bound to his mother and cannot imagine even abandoning her or even marrying somebody else. Remember, complementing the theme of bondage is the novel's treatment of jealousy. Remember that, treatment of jealousy. When you hear jealousy with respect to this novel, you should always think of the mother character, Gertrude Morel. Or write Mrs. Morel if you can't remember the first name. Mrs. Morel is constantly jealous of her son's lovers. Okay, that is the name, sons and lovers. Okay, and she masks her jealousy very thinly. Morel is jealous over his wife's close relationship with his sons and over their successes. The father figure is also jealous because the mother has close relationships with the sons. Then there are contradictions and oppositions throughout the novel. Lawrence demonstrates how contradictions emerge so easily in human nature, especially with love and hate. So that is also very much discussed in the play. He also uses the opposition of the body and mind to expose the contradictory nature of desire. You need to know that as well. Remember, we studied that he had great sense of eco-consciousness in him. Who? D.H.Lawrence. So we can say that Sons and Lovers has a great deal of description of the natural environment. Often the weather and environment reflect the character's emotions through the literary technique of pathetic fallacy. Okay, you can just understand that there is due importance given to nature and the environment with respect to this novel. So now let's move on to some of the major concerns discussed in this novel. So those who are looking into the textbook, you may please turn over to page number 25.